Welcome to the Wiser Wealth Management Roundtable, where we believe the best financial advice is always conflict-free. I'm your host, Casey Smith. Guiding you to financial freedom today is my co-host, Brad Lyons, and our guest today is Robert Swarthout. Good friends,
yes,
golfing buddies.
Absolutely.
Thanks for coming on today to talk about digital currency.
It's a fascinating subject that's coming on the scene very quickly, and it's almost to the point where it's becoming part of our nomenclature, but rarely do people fully understand what they're saying when they use the term.
Everybody looks at the screen on CNBC and says Bitcoin, and at the height of Bitcoin, my barber would ask me if I had Bitcoin, how much he should buy in Bitcoin. Robert and I were out for a casual game of golf, and he entertained us for 9 holes talking about digital currency. I had no idea you knew so much about this, and it's a very exciting topic because it's something new and something I get asked a lot. So, Robert, give us an intro to digital currency.
Yes. So digital currency, blockchain, crypto, digital assets, there's all sorts of names for this stuff, but a blockchain is essentially a system of recording information in a way that makes it difficult or impossible to change, hack, or cheat the system.
Basically, it's a database that's sitting out there in space.
That is true. It is actually a type of database. Absolutely.
So it's a database. It's tracking transactions.
Yes. A traditional database, a user can come in with the correct permissions and can make changes to it. That is not something that is part of this design. The idea is it is written and never changed again. And each subsequent transaction can be referenced previous transactions to kind of prove the authority. And maybe your account balance is a great example that you can prove since the beginning of time of that blockchain, kind of the state of things.
Right.
So the chain are the transactions, or at least the memory of the transactions linked together in sequence.
Yes. It is, in a technical way of saying it, is a time sequence. And yes, each transaction has a reference to the previous one, and then that one has a reference to its previous one. So there's no like one-to-many relationship. It is a one-to-one relationship along the way.
So how does that work with a Bitcoin platform where people think you can make transactions, you're investing in this currency?
Yep. So with Bitcoin and many others, you can come in and you can buy them at an exchange, much like a brokerage account, and you own them. And you can transfer them to other Bitcoin addresses, or you can keep them there. You can do whatever. To prove that you bought it or made a transaction and transferred it to another account, the Bitcoin network has to functionally do a bunch of math to prove it. That's part of what makes it really, in Bitcoin's case, very intensive and power and compute intensive, and inherently using a lot of electricity to do so. Bitcoin has a bit of a stigma of being maybe bad for the environment. I think I might get these numbers a little bit wrong, but if I was to transfer some Bitcoin from my address to your address, that transaction happens, and it happens within, say, about 15 minutes, that transaction would go through. But the electricity to do that, I think, powers a U.S. home for about 3 months.
Wow.
I hope I got that right. But it's some crazy number that
And that's because it's just looking to verify that transaction and the amount of energy
Yes.
it takes to do that?
Absolutely. It's a lot of math going on again, and it's just basically trying to cryptographically prove.
Well, I'm jumping ahead, but it sort of makes sense because I remember in Venezuela, who has their local currency just completely trashed, right? That it was illegal to mine or process Bitcoin, and they would catch people by their power bill.
Absolutely. A lot of the mining, I believe it's over or right at 60% of the Bitcoin mining that happens in the world happens in China, near, I believe, the Three Gorges Dam, because power is so cheap there, which presents a whole other set of problems geopolitically. Like if you control more than 51% of the compute power on one of these networks, you technically can come in and change a transaction because you control the network with 51%. That hasn't necessarily happened in a really big use case yet. I mean, it happens on some older blockchains because they're not as noticed and not as much compute on them, so it's easier to become 51%, but it's a challenge. It kind of goes against the ethos of what the crypto was to begin with. It should be unchanged. Well, all of a sudden I can come in with 51 or 60% of the power and say, nope, this US account over here has 0. I have it all. It challenges the trust in the system.
Right. Is that something that gets monitored?
There's websites out there that track this, but again, who's going to enforce that? It is a international thing. You could question whether the Chinese government was doing it or whether something else was going on there.
We just touched on one point, which I didn't intend to. If this is the risk of digital currencies, one of the risks,
one of the
right?
many, yes.
Yes. So let's back up a bit. Let's talk about how many different digital currencies are there?
The last time I looked earlier this month, just out of curiosity, it was around 4,600. Most of them have absolutely no value, or they're just somebody set up a project. If 15 minutes from now, we could create a Casey coin, and there could be 100 billion of them. But guess what? They probably don't have value until you start convincing your friends that Casey coin is the next big thing, and they should buy them.
So for these people who create essentially a cryptocurrency, are they doing it because they see a need in the marketplace that other cryptocurrencies don't address, or are they just trying to get in on this wave of digital currencies?
Yes.
Very good answer.
I would hope that most of the time when they're doing this, it is trying to solve a problem with them. The ones that are just trying to catch lightning in a bottle, it may happen momentarily, but it's certainly not going to be around for the long term. My guess is 90% of those 4,600 do absolutely nothing. Haven't looked at most of them, obviously.
So your Bitcoin, for the older people listening, would be kind of like your Betamax. It's not officially Betamax. It doesn't mean that it's irrelevant anymore. Mm-hmm. But there could be an underlying currency that really takes over that.
A lot of times when people say Bitcoin, they may actually mean cryptocurrency generally. They don't realize they're saying Kleenex effectively. Bitcoin is the first one. It came out of frustrations of an anonymous person in the great financial crisis and launched, I believe, in summer 2009. And it was a bit of a proof of concept. It kind of took off in the geeky scene, and it's had its challenges along the way, being tied to drug dealing online and some other nefarious stuff. But I think the industry as a whole has passed that largely, as KYC and AML and the things that kind of make people feel secure in being in a transaction or being part of a jurisdiction in the US, for instance, feel safer. So,
name some other coins, I guess I'll call them, that you consider be more relevant right now. I don't need to go through the whole 4,600.
Yeah, I was going to say, we might not have time for that. We might even have time for the top 100 for that matter. So Bitcoin, a lot of times people rank these by market cap. It's probably not the best way to rank them, but it's currently about the only way to rank them. So Bitcoin is currently number one. Ethereum, with a symbol of ETH, is number two. It's a smart contracts platform. So a developer could write a small bit of code that says, when this happens, transfer these funds from this account to that account. Kind of like an escrow agent of sorts. It's a very simple example. The third one is XRP. Also, the symbol XRP was created by company Ripple. It's all about their initial use case is cross-border remittance and trying to bring the cost of that down and the speed of correspondent banking. Another example is something called VeChain, symbol VET. And their use case that they're targeting is enhancing the supply chain management. So being able to trace, say, green peppers from the field to the grocery store shelf. And if there's a problem with those peppers in that grocery store, they can basically say, oh, it came out of this box, it came on this truck, and it was out of this field, potentially that row.
So with that one, I understand the data and the chain behind that, but how does the currency play in?
It's a great question. So there's, in that one, it actually is a little bit more complicated. VET is the digital asset, and there's a sub asset called VTHO to basically pay for transactions on the network. It's probably getting way too deep quickly here, but but it's a way to kind of prove ownership effectively of that transaction.
Okay.
I don't want to get too deep here.
No, that makes sense.
And another use case, another digital asset that I'll bring up is something called Tether. And I just bring it up because it's a little bit different than the others. Its symbol is USDT. Its purpose is solely to try to represent one tether equals $1. It fluctuates right around 99 cents to a little over $1. But that brings up a whole nother set of questions of, do they actually hold all the dollars in the bank account somewhere that they say that they claim within their system? With the US dollar, you're believing that the government's going to be good for it. This, you have to believe the system is going to be good for it. And if all of a sudden their money in their bank account's gone,
if there's a rise in demand for the tether, the USDT, do they have to put more dollars into the bank theoretically?
That is how it's supposed to work. I don't know which jurisdiction they are domiciled in. I don't think it's the US. I think it's probably somewhere in the Caribbean potentially, or in Singapore. A lot of this stuff happens outside the US because our laws just weren't made for this stuff.
Right.
There's a lot of challenges around taxes and is it technically an equity stake in a business? Most of them will say no. Some of them probably could make that case. In Tether, it actually is an equity stake in the dollar and that they hold, but there's no company behind most of these. So you don't own equity in it. It's not a security, right?
So it's not a security. It's a currency, sort of.
XRP would call itself a bridge asset. So to use XRP in Ripple's first case of trying to help with cross-border remittance, say I want to send money from the U.S. to the Philippines, to the Philippine peso. At the exchange, their software would take your U.S. dollar, convert it into XRP, it's some ratio, transfer the XRP within a couple of seconds to the Philippine exchange, and then convert it into Philippine peso. And do that within a minute versus a SWIFT or MoneyGram or Western Union might take hours or days. And potentially a lot less. I think that transaction would cost about 2 cents in XRP's example versus if I'm doing Western Union and I send it down there, $200 turns into $40 in fees.
Right.
Which is sad.
But that does make an interesting point in that there are companies that do have years and years and years of experience of transferring money back and forth across borders and within borders, that if these digital currencies effectively do that, why wouldn't these companies want to get involved with that as another method to serve customers transferring monies around the world?
Great question. So in the example I used of Western Union and MoneyGram, Western Union largely has stayed at arm's length from this. They're the big player in the world, and they have a treasury department they feel is really efficient. They do have currency risk, right? They have all these currencies parked all over the place in bank accounts, and they're hoping the rates don't move drastically. MoneyGram is a smaller player in this space, but they also, to my understanding, have started using, in the case of going from US dollar to Mexican peso, they have kind of set up a separate rail that they're doing this on as a test bed. It does work. They talk about it on their earnings calls from time to time. And it's crawl, walk, run. They're somewhere between the crawl and the walk, I would guess. It's a bit of a challenge to their business. They went from having this system they've built over the course of decades where they feel like they can justify charging $40 for $200 to all of a sudden saying, okay, this transaction happens to 2 cents. Like, what is the value I'm providing to people on both ends of this transaction?
That's going to be interesting to see, because that's actually, if you think back to Western Union's history, even back to like World War II, they've had to adapt.
Right. Oddly, they've adapted many times.
Right. So they should have some experience. Whether those people are still around or not, I don't know, but they should have some experience of adapting from telegrams all the way through now, I guess, having to navigate currency transactions in 2 seconds to do what would take normally 4 days, it sounds like.
Another similar example there is if you go to a credit union, if you're a customer there and you want to send funds to, say, someone, a bank account in Europe somewhere, there's a good chance that your bank, your credit union may not do it at all, or they're going to do a wire transfer and they're going to have to do it via correspondent banking. So they would route it from their bank to maybe a slightly bigger bank or to one of the top 5 banks in the US that does the routing overseas because they have enough aggregate transactions there they can make it worth it. With this new world potentially that's coming with digital assets, they don't really need to do that. So it strips out those fees. It SWIFT transfer from the US to Euro in Europe somewhere could take 4 days. The banks may make it seem like it goes a lot faster, but it really takes them 3 to 4 days behind the scenes. Sometimes you don't even know where the money's at in the process. It gets lost 6% of the time. That's scary. Like, then they have to go figure out where the funds went, which bank they got left at in the fees. So SWIFT was built in the 70s and really hasn't changed. This is a challenge to that.
Obviously, cross-border transactions, we've kind of been focused on that. A little bit about, okay, if I get a bad batch of food, we can hopefully track that through blockchain so we don't have to throw out all the broccoli, right? But what about other uses for the digital currency?
Yes, so we've gone through a lot of finance. Capital markets, I think, is another example. If you sell a stock, I think, was it a 4-day settlement period, something like that, 2 days? There's no reason why that shouldn't be instant, in my opinion. With the technology, we live in a digital age. Everything's on a computer anyways. It's not like somebody's running down the street with those stock certificates signed.
Right.
Used to be.
Yeah, it used to be, but we're a little bit past that. We talked about shipping logistics. And another case is just providing the ability to say that something is legitimate. So it's a big issue in the wine market, right? Especially old wine. Did somebody fake this bottle of wine? Or Was this Louis Vuitton bag real? Counterfeiting, there's a way to kind of prove that all the way through the chain, not the blockchain in this case, but the chain of command, like did it come from the right factory? Is it legit? I mean, at the end of the day, there's use cases for that.
Is tracking the custody of the product from manufacturer or from owner through the supply chain to the ultimate buyer.
Absolutely. There's a company, I believe their name is Proppy. They're based in San Francisco, or at least California, that helps you do house transactions through the blockchain. They're basically your real estate agent, and paperwork and everything's electronic, and you can pay for it digitally, and house transactions, 30, 45 days, right? And it's and there's a lot of paperwork and risk because there's all these different hands touching it. Well, a transaction can be atomic in the sense that it can't be unwound on a blockchain if everyone proves that they have what they need up front, and boom, it's done. Then you, quote unquote, have ownership of your house. Granted, that deed turns out has to be filed with the county and put on paper somewhere. But maybe in a future world, they don't have to do that.
I was about to say that in the end, it has to go through a closing attorney or a title company for sure, based on how we are now with our data. That's interesting. A lot of people look at digital currencies as being speculative, which I think we would all agree is very speculative.
Very.
Is it like lotto ticket speculative, or is there a little more meat behind it?
I don't even know how to answer that. I would say,
if you got $10,000, you're going to put it in digital currency. What are your expectations?
To me, it definitely has to be viewed as a lottery ticket, because while they're only speculative, there's nothing else that it can be, right? But as these things actually start solving real world problems, they actually start showing utility. To me, that's where the value comes into them. If I want to buy a lottery ticket, I just go buy a lottery ticket. I guess a lottery ticket, it's either you have one chance to get it right. These, you have multiple days you can hold them. So maybe it's a little bit less risky. I don't know.
Right.
I'm not a financial advisor, so I can't really speak to that. But it is a challenge. A lot of the vast majority of stuff that happens on these exchanges where you can buy and sell them is people trying to be day traders with it. In crypto land, for crypto to be up or down 10% a day, that is ho-hum. Some days they're flat, other days they're all over the place. And it makes it not a great place to put money that you need immediately, that's for sure. It's like going to the casino, I think is probably a better example than a lottery ticket. But it's something that you might want a small sliver of. It depends on what your situation is.
When you look at the list that you named off, Bitcoin, Ethereum, XRP, which is Ripple, VeChain, Tether, you look at that list, everything below Bitcoin, we lost our listener because they probably have never heard of those. Do you think that ends up being different currencies for different purposes in the long run?
Absolutely. I think that, if somebody was watching CNBC in fall of 2017, when all the crypto market went crazy up, they probably heard of Bitcoin, Ethereum. At the time, people would confuse XRP and Ripple as the same thing and say Ripple. The company, I think, has done a better job of differentiating itself from the asset itself, XRP. But Bitcoin was the original. XRP was technically the second. Ethereum was a little bit later on the scene, but it's all about use cases at the end of the day. I think if you could somehow have a lens into 5 or 10 years down the road, most of these probably will still be around, the ones we've talked about, but they may be in different forms, or they may be very niched at that point because of more competition. Again, those 4,600, there's a lot of potential competition out there.
People ask me, should I have gold in my portfolio? And there are times when gold would benefit a portfolio. And Brad, you're our portfolio specialist here at Wiser, and even you don't recommend we have gold in the portfolio. I think if you want to own gold, you buy the actual coins, you have them at your house. Because usually if you ask people why they want to own it, it's for security. It's if the world crumbles, I have this asset. And they're like, well, if the world crumbles, you're not going to be able to access the financial markets to get your certificate shares of ETFs. You need to actually own the coin, which requires you to then physically hold it. My vision for this, and this is maybe very simple, but my vision for this is one night, late night, can't sleep, flipping through channels. I see the military channel on. I stop there and everyone's like vacating. I guess it was Vietnam when we pulled out of Vietnam. So they were landing. We'd given the Vietnamese, I guess, our helicopters, right? We'd sold them or whatever. And so their soldiers who were airmen were flying the helicopters. They knew what was about to happen when we were leaving. They were flying the helicopters to pick up their families, and they were flying out to the ocean, and they would find a Navy ship, and they would land the helicopter on the ship, and then the families would get out. they're safe. They're going to go to America at this point, and they would shove the helicopter into the ocean. Then another one would come out. And so, well, this one guy, I guess he picked up his family, but he had, is it the Swarovski helicopter that has the dual blades on top, right? So he has the air helicopter with the dual blades on top. It is not going to fit on this little boat in the middle of the ocean. And so you see him drop his family down. It's like 3 kids, a wife, on ropes onto this Navy ship. And then he does this perfect move where he backs the helicopter away. He rolls it to the right and he jumps out. And he goes into the water and you don't see him. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they televised this guy like drowning in the ocean. This is crazy. It's like, it's real film. It's a little blurry, old film. Well, he eventually pops up and they pull him up on the ship. The commentator goes, well, he had sold all his possessions and gotten a gold bar. And he was holding a gold bar and he couldn't swim with the gold bar. He should have lowered it down with his wife. Maybe he was concerned about her going shopping with the gold bar or something. I don't know. But he jumped out with this backpack and he couldn't swim and carried this gold. And so he had to drop the gold to the bottom of the ocean. So fast forward to modern day, I kind of look at this as I'm in a country, it's failing. I'm taking all my possessions and I'm transferring it into this currency. I'm going to get on an airplane. I'm going to fly to a new place. And then as I choose, I could convert that digital currency, maybe it's Bitcoin, back into local currency, right?
Right.
And I can start a new life.
Yes.
That's a really long story. But that's kind of how I see it.
It was a great story.
That's kind of how I see it. It's like a
enthralled.
doomsday thing. It's like for us here in America, we don't have those worries. We don't have the worry of waking up and our dollar has overly inflated overnight or deflated overnight. We're not worried about our country going out of business, despite the politicians trying to scare us into voting for him, saying it could happen. It's not happening. America's not shutting down. But if I live in an emerging market country, there's a real chance, right?
The example that comes to mind, you've obviously heard about Zimbabwe, Venezuela, their currencies going all over the place. But I believe it was back in February or March, maybe when the COVID stuff started hitting around the world. And in Iran, they were having issues and they were worried about the economy shutting down, all this kind of stuff. And people were taking their Iranian currency, I forget what it is offhand, and converting it into Bitcoin at a rate that was double the rate what it would have been in the US.
Wow.
So even if you do it, you kind of have to worry that it's a fair rate, right?
Very true.
Because
they're paying a premium.
They would also get to the U.S. and have half of what they thought they were going to have. Probably weren't coming to the U.S., but like going to Europe or something.
This USDT, the tether.
They paid a higher rate coming in. So
what you're saying is what you pay depends on where you are.
The local exchange. I mean, exchanges should be quote unquote free markets, but they probably weren't terribly free down there.
Right.
Probably had pretty limited options, maybe one option for that matter.
Belief plays a huge role in all this. I mean, they believed that it would store wealth. And the whole concept of currency is storing wealth. Mm-hmm. It's wealth that doesn't need to be spent right now. So you store it in your currency. And they believed that at some point in time that they could convert that digital asset back into usable assets because it was storing wealth. And the more that people believe that this is going to happen, the better the efficacy of it actually happening.
Yeah, it's interesting because very much crypto is all about trying to take trust out of things. So the ability, you don't have to worry about having someone in the middle of a transaction to kind of like make sure everyone's going to play by the rules. But at the same time, trust in the system is really important because that's where some of the value comes from. People believing that it's going to be worth what we think it's going to be worth the day to whatever down the road.
So we've talked about how digital currencies have a use, a purpose. But that purpose, and I'm asking, I guess, was never really intended to replace our currency. It's to operate alongside it.
There were certainly parts of, I believe it was the Bitcoin community early on that were like, this is going to be a different dollar. We're getting rid of the Fed, the Treasury, everything. We're starting over. Very grandiose, right? That's not going to happen.
No.
At least not in the US. But I think that the companies and the different people in the space that are trying to figure out ways to move technology into place that enhances or reduces costs or provides better security, those are the ones that will win out long term versus trying to like overthrow a government effectively. Like,
Right.
like good luck.
There was some coffee shop in Manhattan that would take Bitcoin payments. And the reporter was like, well, it took me 15 minutes, but I actually paid with Bitcoin and it cost me $10 for a $2 coffee.
Yep.
Or it was something like that. There's probably no $2 coffee in Manhattan, but the idea was it was an insanely premium amount of money for that.
You'll every once in a while see, like when you come into a door, they might say, we take Visa, MasterCard, Discover on it. You might see the symbol for Bitcoin. That's the only one I ever see, if I ever see one at all. It is probably not the correct digital asset to do that with due to how long it takes the transaction to go through, roughly 15 minutes. And the cost, I think, is on average about $5.
Wow.
So your $7 coffee turns into $12 coffee that's cold when you get it.
But it was cool.
Yeah, but I use new technology.
Right.
Bitcoin largely, I think, is viewed these days as a store of value. That's kind of what they trumpet versus trying to be a transaction-based system of some kind.
I know earlier we were talking a little bit about the underserved communities where financial services may not be as readily available as they are in Manhattan, where on every corner there's a financial services outlet. How can digital assets provide a better opportunity for underserved areas to have financial transactions readily available to them?
I think this numbers are between 20 and 25% of the U.S. is underbanked or unbanked 100%, which is sad. And they probably don't have tons of assets they're keeping in hand, but what they do have, they're putting under their mattress effectively, which is a different set of problems. I think digital assets can help solve that. They largely probably have a smartphone, so they have access to technology so they can actually do, say, a transfer of a digital asset to pay for something. Like a QR code is a way that you see it happen these days. You can scan something, and then that basically helps your wallet understand the address it needs to go to, so it makes it a little more user-friendly. And I think even a more extreme case is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is doing some work in, I believe it's Africa, to the point where like this is communities that like definitely third world. They're trying to help them understand what a bank is and like understand what the modern day bank might look like. It's probably not some place with a teller you drive through in the middle of Africa. It's if I need to send a little bit of money to this guy because I just got a goat or something from him to be able to make that happen. And it's really cool. There's challenges with, is there good cell service there? So they're trying to solve different kinds of problems, but these digital assets can provide the ability to do that because the transaction cost can be so minimal versus a bank has to employ employees and all this other stuff to kind of like make you feel safe with your money effectively.
So we don't own digital currencies in our portfolios here at Wiser. I do have personally some very small amount of digital currency that I own through an app on my phone, essentially. Why don't you tell us, Robert, a little bit about how do you purchase digital currencies? Because it's actually really easy.
The one I typically recommend is Coinbase.com. You can download the app in the app stores. It's going to act much like a brokerage account. You just can either pay for it via a debit card or you can do a wire transfer and or ACH to kind of get the funds in there. Another one is Uphold.com. And they're both licensed in the needed states and U.S. regulators and all that kind of stuff. You might find some exchanges that aren't available in all states, and that's not uncommon because each state kind of has a different regulatory framework, which only makes this more complicated for those exchanges. The U.S. needs to get its act together at a national level about laws and how these things are taxed and how they're viewed as something a security, or is it a digital asset, or is it a bridge asset? Like there needs to be potentially new classifications for this stuff. But in exchange, 5 minutes after downloading the app, you could be buying stuff in. They're going to have you go through a quick KYC process, typically upload a driver's license, and you're off you go.
Well, we talked earlier offline, probably a 1% of your net worth probably makes sense if you want to do this. And you don't need a brokerage account like traditional brokerage account, but you need these other Coinbase. What's interesting is, I guess in relation to the brokerage account, you own stocks and bonds. You don't go to your brokerage account generally to make transactions also. Mm-hmm. So if you want to start making transactions with digital currencies, are there any platforms for that currently? Like a Venmo for Bitcoin or a Venmo for Ripple or something like that?
Yep. I believe Coinbase is working on it. I know Uphold just launched basically what is a debit card. You can kind of say within your account, when a debit card transaction happens, use this digital currency and it will convert it to the US dollar at the time of transaction.
For a fee, I assume.
Probably with some fees. I haven't personally used them. they just seemed a little gimmicky to me. I'm like, I have USD that I can pay with in a debit or credit card. Why would I do it this other way? Potentially with an asset that's moving 10% a day just seems crazy to me.
Right.
Again, it's a great start. You're never going to get somewhere if you don't start trying. So I think they're trying to figure out what makes sense. It may make sense partially if you're traveling around the world and you're all of a sudden hopping between different countries and you don't want to worry about, say, your credit card actually does charge you international fees. Maybe this is a way to kind of deal with that. I haven't personally tried that, but that's an idea that comes to mind.
Right. But then what are you paying for it? If Bitcoin's moving up and down 10% a day, you never truly know what you're paying for the goods on the other side.
I can't say I've ever heard of somebody having a debit card that's tied to a stock or
right.
a metal of some
stock,
kind. I'm kind of like, it
true.
feels similar to me in that sense, although one's a security, one is not. But it just kind of like assets that can move all around, you probably don't be paying your coffee with it each day.
Right, absolutely. So again, it kind of goes back to really it's just more of a holding. It's a place where you hold something, not something that you use every day. So we kind of touched on this already, but I think my last point in this is it an investment? Is it for doomsday? Is it for more practical matters? To me, based on this conversation today, it sounds it's probably going to be something part of the future. Maybe it doesn't look exactly the way it does now. It could be for investment, but it should be a very small portion, not counted. Here's the financial planner coming out at me, not counted toward your financial plan, not depending on it for retirement, just something on the side because you've already taken care of your emergency reserve. You've already taken care of your saving for retirement. Kids' college is good. Checked all these boxes. Then you come back to something like this and go, well, maybe if I put 1% in this and it becomes something really big, I can make a lot of return on it. There are ETFs that have been proposed in this space. None of them have come out yet. Bitcoin ETF or a digital currency ETF has not been approved yet. Currently, you can invest in a fund, but it's actually what we would call like a private equity investment. You have to have $1 million liquid net worth, and you're buying into a trust that owns a portfolio of these currencies. So I don't know that that's super necessary at this point when you can do it on a Coinbase app because it's probably the younger generation that's making these kind of moves anyway. Gentlemen, great conversation. We ran over more than we normally do, but I think this is something that everyone has questions about and they don't fully understand the purpose, and they may still not fully understand the purpose because it does get a little complicated trying to get someone to understand a blockchain and you can't
touch and feel it.
Yeah, you can't touch and feel it. It's just kind of out there in space. But Robert, thanks for taking part of your day to come in and talk with us.
Thanks for having me.
Wiser Wealth Management Incorporated is a registered investment advisor. Information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and unless otherwise stated are not guaranteed. Be sure to first consult with a qualified financial advisor and/or tax professional before implementing any strategy discussed herein. Past performance is not indicative of future performance.